afternoon. Thanks for the privilege of your time. This is the SALVANT report. Last time we talked about the regime change temptation in Venezuela. And today what we're going to analyze, it's what we call a grand bargain with Venezuela. Because we know American forces won't dislodge Maduro, but American diplomacy might. The American president, it seems, has it out for Venezuela. Over the summer, his administration began massive naval power in the Caribbean, largely near the country's coast, and striking ships soon after they exit its territorial waters. In October, the American president has authorized the CIA to carry out operations within Venezuela's borders. And the American president has repeatedly railed against President Nicolas Maduro, accusing him of emptying Venezuela prisons into the US and saying that his days in office are numbered. This week, Washington moved an aircraft carrier group to the Caribbean, and the American president was briefed on possible military options, including land strikes. Publicly, the White House maintained its operation as simply designed to stop narcotics, not to facilitate regime change. But we think that's not true, because the scale of the military deployment, it is the largest in the Caribbean since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And the accompanying rhetoric suggests Washington's real objective is toppling the government. If the American president does attack Venezuela, it is unlikely to end well. If the American president does attack Venezuela, it is unlikely to end well, because history has taught us a lot of lessons. The United States has long conducted covert intervention in other countries' domestic politics, in Afghanistan, Albania, and Angola, just to name a few. But this pattern was especially pronounced in Latin America, where Washington attempted at least 18 covert regime changes during the Cold War. In 1954, he overthrew Guatemala's democratically elected government, ushering in a military regime that rounded up thousands of opponents and presided over a 36-year civil war that killed an estimated 200,000 people. In 1961, the US backed the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba and launch a coup in the Dominican Republic that unintentionally provoked the assassination of the dictator Rafael Trujillo. He also supported coup in Brazil in 1964, in Bolivia in 1971, and Chile in 1973, and America, the US, has funded the contract rebels in Nicaragua throughout the 1960s. And among its overt option for regime change, the United States this time tried to intimidate Maduro into leaving power with threats of force. Yet, not of one of these previous operations I talked to you about, I listed a while ago, produced a stable pro-American democracy. And even if, against all odds, Venezuela's opposition seized sudden control of the country, there is no guarantee that its ascendance will lead a durable democratic transition. As we have two political sciences wrote in Foreign Affairs, Alexander Downs and Lindsay O'Rourke wrote in Foreign Affairs, that strike alone have never driven a leader from office. American airstrike alone have never in the past driven a leader from office. American forces won't dislodge Maduro, but American democracy might. The American president, of course, could decide to attack anyway. But the White House probably knows that a simple show of force won't topple Maduro. And for all of President fiery rhetoric, he has historically, the American president has historically opposed large-scale military intervention involving prolonged deployment and nation building. And in this case, that's what he needs if you use force. Instead, through his two administration, 45 and 47, the American president has consistently approached thorny domestic and foreign policy issues with a strategy that he laid out in his 1987 book, The Art of the Deal. He said, escalate to negotiate. We have seen that because shortly after North Korea tested nuclear missiles capable of hitting the US in 2018, the American president threatened it with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Escalate to negotiate. He then held 3 summits on denuclearization with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Most did. The president threatened to pull the United States out of NATO if other members did not raise their own level of military spending. Most did. Most of the country did that. And so Washington has stayed out. If this time the American president plan is to force regime change in Venezuela, then it could be walking into an embarrassing and an expensive failure. Let's repeat that again. If the president's plan is to force regime change in Venezuela, then it could be walking into an embarrassing and expensive failure. And Benjamin Franklin told them that if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. But if he sees the military buildup as a prelude to a diplomatic overture, he has a shot at notching perhaps the most significant foreign policy win of his administration. To succeed, however, Washington must understand that democratic transition do not happen overnight. It's time for Washington to understand that democratic transition do not happen overnight. Then what is the best solution? The U.S. should thus use its leverage to get both sides of Venezuela's internal political conflict to the negotiating table. It's as simple as that. It should then force each to abandon its maximalist goal, obliterating the other, and instead accept sharing power. A deal that does this may not feel as satisfying to some as would a military strike. A deal like that does this may not. A deal that does this, meaning bringing to the negotiating table the international political forces, the opposition and the government to the negotiating table. A deal that does this may not feel as satisfying to some as would a military strike. Unlike a CIA operation to remove Maduro, it does not promise immediate result. And we think that's what Washington is looking for, immediate result. Or it has never happened in the history of the world. Democratic transition do not happen overnight. But bringing the faction to the negotiating table, it's far more likely to be effective at advancing U.S. interests. improving the lives of Venezuelans, and setting the stage for the country's democratization. Washington, if you are listening, it's time for you to understand that democratic transition do not happen overnight. And it's the best solution to use your leverage to get both sides of Venezuela's internal political conflict to the negotiating table. Because when it comes to attempts at regime change, Venezuela is a graveyard of ideas. Remember, during his first administration, number 45, the U.S. imposed punitive economic sanctions on the country's oil and mining sectors, believing that depriving the government of crucial resources would lead to its implosion. It didn't. Maduro stayed in power, even as the sanction helped provoke the largest peacetime economic contractions and migration exodus in modern history. We're supposed to find a new way. But there is another approach to handling Maduro, one that has not been properly attempted. Brokering a coexistence agreement between the president and his opponents. That's a new approach. But it must be properly attempted. Rather than forcing Maduro to give up power immediately, a demand that has repeatedly proved unrealistic, the goal with such a deal would be to incentivize his government to gradually yet meaningfully democratize the country. These ideas share some elements with the president's first administration democratic transition framework for Venezuela. That was the plan. That plan, the democratic transition framework for Venezuela, that plan outlined in 2020 would have created a council of state featuring both government and opposition representatives to oversee a transition to free and fair election. But the framework treated the power-sharing councils as a short-term bridge to national elections, which would come within at most a year. To work, coexistence agreement almost always need to run for a longer time, as this one should. Decades of potential science research show that this kind of so-called pacted transition offer one of the most stable avenues for ending authoritarian rule. Latin America alone has multiple states: Brazil, Mexico, Uruguay, in which reforms initiated by an authoritarian government created a level political playing field that has lasted across multiple governments. It is, by contrast, rare to find cases in which an external intervention has led to a doable process of democratization in the absence of a prolonged military occupation. And Venezuela, in particular, needs a pacted transition. After years of dictatorship, the country is deeply divided. What would be the consequences if we don't use that another approach? Without a power sharing deal, however, Venezuela's opposition is unlikely to construct a big tent. Instead, he might use the presidency to seek revenge. He has, after all, failed to condemn the forced deportation and killings of Venezuelans in the Caribbean. He has advocated for sanctions that have severely damaged the country's economy. We're talking about the opposition. The opposition has, in other words, subordinated human rights concern to political objective, which is the hallmark of an authoritarian movement. Couple that with Venezuela's winner-take-all political institution. That's in Venezuela. Winner-take-all political institution. It is not hard to imagine an anti-Chavista president becoming the mirror image of Maduro and using the institution for the state to viciously persecute opponents. It is not hard to imagine Washington, if you're listening, an anti-Chavista president becoming the mirror image of Maduro and using the institution of the state to viciously persecute opponents. If anti-Chavista leaders do prioritize vengeance, Venezuela will not only face continued autocracy and economic malaise, but also risk civil war. The country's military is packed with Chavistas. And should Venezuela's next leader systematically purge them, they might start an armed insurgency drawing on support from Colombian guerrillas and organized crime network that have long a strong presence in Venezuela. The result could be a prolonged internal conflict, reminiscence of the one that has plagued Colombia for over 50 years. We must come up with an offer President Maduro cannot refuse. For one, Venezuela's constitution, and I want you to listen to that, for example, allows the president to convene election for a constitutional convention that can dissolve the other branches of government at any time. This prerogative will almost certainly be used by the opposition upon taking charge to drive all Chavistas from all state institutions. But Washington, the American president, might be able to prevent a vicious cycle while still easing out Maduro by compelling Venezuela's two camps to forge a joint agreement. The country's opposition is highly dependent on Washington and thus ill-positioned to refuse his demand. Meanwhile, by confronting the Maduro regime with an existential threat unlike any he has faced, America has gained new leverage over Caracas. What would be some key in the agreement, the joint agreement between the forces? In practice, this would mean representatives from the regime would need to agree to carve out quotas for the opposition in key branches of government. Opposition figures should, for example, receive guaranteed representation in the Supreme Court, the Electoral Council, and the country's key oversight institution. A credible arrangement would appoint opposition representatives to 8 of the 20 states in the Supreme Court, with another 4 justices chosen from figures acceptable to both sides. Opposition nominated justices should hold a majority of vote in some key Supreme Court chambers, such as the criminal cassation chambers. Similarly, in that grand bargain with Venezuela, negotiators must agree to the appointment of new prosecutor general, comptroller general, and an ombudsperson. at least one of these positions should be held by an opposition nominee and another by a figure acceptable to both sides. An impartial or opposition's ally comptroller general who oversees the use of public funds and investigate corruption in public administration, for example, could reassess the bans on political participation that have played a key role in reducing the competitiveness of Venezuelans' election. And to have some of these reforms will require that Venezuela amend its constitution. You remember when we said a while ago that the Venezuela's constitution allows the president to convene election for a constitutional convention that can dissolve the other branch of government at any time. This must be changed, this must be amended, therefore the Venezuelan constitution must be amended. Most importantly, the new constitution should emerge from an inclusive national discussion and be approved by Venezuelan voters in a referendum. That referendum would double as an opportunity for the new electoral authority to establish its credibility before the Venezuelan and before the whole world. Reforming Venezuela's institution will naturally be a protracted process, but there are steps the country could take immediately, including ending political persecution and other human rights abuses. The Maduro government should begin with the release of all political prisoners and the approval of a new law to limit arbitrary detention. It could create an impartial oversight body, and this body would also have the authority to ensure that the country's national telecommunication office stops using its regulatory authority to censor speech. These institutional and legal reforms would go a long way in facilitating Venezuela's democratic transition. This is a new approach. This is a grand bargain with Venezuela when we know that American forces would not be able to dislodge Maduro. The US, however, would lift all economic sanctions on the country, and in collaboration with the International Monetary Fund, and private creditors coordinate to give Venezuela the financial and technical assistance it needs to embark on reforms aimed at restoring its economic competitiveness and rebuild its social and physical infrastructure. Venezuela, Washington, if you are listening, Venezuela will be able to carry out a free and fair contest until its new institutional framework is consolidated and the economy is clearly rebounding, a process that is likely to take 3 to 5 years. This requires a virtue that Washington doesn't have. It's called patience. 3 to 5 years. Even then, election must proceed under a predetermined schedule. You don't jump to presidential election. First local, then regional, then parliamentary, and finally presidential. The transitory judiciary, electoral, and oversight bodies that embody the power sharing arrangement will have to remain in place with the same split membership through at least the first post-transition presidential term. This Washington requires patience because this process would likely take 3 to 5 years. For American officials eager to get rid of Maduro, a pacted transition might sound far too slow and far too intricate because they don't have patience for that. But in Venezuela, there are no shortcuts to a better future. And this proposal, deliberate pace, is what he holds more promise than any alternative promising immediate solution. Let me repeat that again for you, Washington. But in Venezuela, there are no shortcuts to a better future. And this proposal, deliberate pace, is why it holds more promise than any alternative promising immediate solution. It would also contribute to addressing Washington's political priorities by allowing the U.S. and Venezuela to work together to reduce transnational crime and migration pressures. This agreement will be staunchly opposed by extremists on both ends of Venezuela's political spectrum. But that is not unusual. Democratic transitions are, more than anything, a process of finding common ground between moderates on different sides of polarized politics. The potential upside to the current U.S. military buildup off the coast of Venezuela may lie precisely in the uncertainty it has generated. The potential upside to the current U.S. military buildup off the coast of Venezuela may lie precisely in the uncertainty it has generated. The risks are now high, not just for the Maduro government, which faces the real prospect of a massive military attack, but also for the opposition, whose near total dependence on U.S. support has been laid bare. The American president's threat of fire and fury could presage violence, but it could just as easily create an opening for a negotiated transition, one that breaks a catastrophic stalemate and allows Venezuelans to reclaim their future. Thank you for the privilege of your time in the SALVANT report.